Hey everybody, quick note on this episode. My brother Seth is joining me. We are interviewing John Philip Newell, and I hope you enjoy it. We've had him on the show before. At the end, I'll explain kind of where I've been the last 2 years, but for now, enjoy this episode.
I'm David Glenn Taylor, and this is the Voyagers podcast. A few months ago, I was in Scotland, the ancestral home of my mother's family, the McMurrays. But it's a place the McMurrays lost touch with centuries ago. Over the last handful of years, I've been trying to reconnect to that heritage. Like so many Americans, I've been trying to find some thread of meaning in that rooted history found in the old country. That journey has been spiritual in nature. I have this theory that each one of us is deeply tied to a place on this earth and that some part of our psyche needs to connect to that place to find itself. For me, this journey has been about reconnecting to God. I left religion behind over a decade ago, and yet the yearning for spiritual meaning and purpose has never left me. Maybe that's my religious programming, maybe that's just psychology, but I've got this overwhelming feeling that there is a power that created all things, and that power is meant for everyone. When I'm in Scotland more than anywhere else, I feel that aching deep in my gut. All that to say that 2 years ago I interviewed the philosopher, writer, and theologian John Philip Newell for an episode of this show. He had written a book. It was called Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, and it had touched a deep longing inside me. So I was super excited when his agent reached out asking if we could do an episode around his new book. That new book is called The Great Search, Turning to Earth and Soul in the Quest for Healing and Home. As you'll hear, for me, it was the right book at the right time. I hope it is for you as well. Enjoy. This book, I read it this last weekend, and it's really an interesting thing because I've gone through a similar experience, and I'll ask Seth to kind of talk about his in terms of loss of faith. And I honestly have been going through a journey where I began to believe that religion has to die, like it has to go away. There's no solution, and yet I've been caught in that paradox of, but if we don't have it, how do we stay healthy as a society? How do we stay moral? Because I see kind of a degradation of morality that's been happening in a kind of a tearing down of our social fabric and our politics, or everything that is kind of wearing down. And I go, we don't seem to have an engine for driving forward a message of truth and kindness and love and goodness and stuff. You know what I mean? And I've been stuck there for some time. I'm curious, and I would love to hear maybe a bit on your journey of that, because it seems like that's what you've been going through. Where did it start for you?
I think it's been a gradual journey for many years. Certainly my deep accessing of the wisdom of the Celtic stream, the Celtic lineage of spiritual wisdom, I think that prepared me or enabled me to be asking some questions about religion as we've known it in the Western world. Because the Celtic tradition wants to celebrate someone like Thomas Berry, but also someone like Eriugena in the 9th century, is really speaking about accessing three texts to know wisdom. And so one is the text of earth itself, seen as sacred text. The second, Eriugena refers to as the small text, the text of scripture, particularly little. And then there's the interior text, the text of the human soul. And he sees that we need to be accessing all three texts to access what is true and of God. So I think that provided quite a contrast to so much Western religious thought, in which truth is seen almost as dispensed from above. The impression is that we need to, in a sense, sign up to this hierarchy of dispensed truth. I would say that some of the chaos that we're in the midst of now, in terms of asking, well, where is truth to be found? Where is a sense of true morality and sacredness to be found? I think in part we're in this situation because religious authority has not encouraged us to access true wisdom deep within us. So we've been very dependent on a type of hierarchy of truth. And quite rightly, we've become disillusioned with that whole system of dispensing truth from above. And it's created now this sort of vacuum or this absence in which almost anyone can assert what is true and declare that any news that we don't like is fake news. So where is our authority now? And I think it makes this an exciting time, because I think we're coming back into relationship with what many native traditions, indigenous traditions of spirituality were encouraging. And that is, we need to read the text of earth, and we need to read the inner text, as well as the texts that have come down in our religious traditions and cultures, which can be described as scripture.
It was fun reading the book because I went to what I think you call now the School of Celtic Wisdom.
Yeah.
Back, I can't remember, what do we call it when I was going. I went to the early one.
We call it the School of Celtic Consciousness.
That's right. That's right. We did.
It's a good title, but we discovered no one knew how to spell consciousness.
That is,
Well,
that is
it was fun to hear because many of those teachings were the teachings that you were kind of working out and speaking in those spaces, and to have experienced a lot of even the meditations that you're doing, we experienced together, in those groups, and even on Iona. I found John Muir is the most compelling to me. And even kind of connecting to the question that David just asked you, because it seems to me, and doing what I do for a living, I get this really interesting sample because I'm working with in the anxiety of all the people in the culture, and everyone's searching for that. What is our authority? And Muir had this, I suppose you could call him a true mystic, but but what he was doing was finding that cathedral of earth, right? And the trees, and his relationship to the sequoias and stuff like that was a type of seeking that I think that's what you're seeing now. Like you're saying that I mean, I see more people seeking it in nature. I see more people. It's like this great just desert area where there is no authority, there is no truth. There is this yearning and this seeking that is opening up, and I think that in the return of those indigenous ways is happening so profoundly. White people in specifically struggle to connect to their indigenous self, and because we're all kind of this diaspora in a sense. You know what I mean? Like, I've lived in the Pacific Northwest, which is just nature in ways that are just shockingly beautiful, but I am not native to this land. David lives in Hawaii. He is not native to this land. I'm curious, do you see yourself in any way like as a teacher of the indigenous white race, like a way of helping white people connect to their indigenous self because it's so lost within us?
I have again and again over the years been intrigued by the resonances between Celtic spirituality and native wisdom from many parts of the world, to the extent that I've been prepared to speak about the Celtic as a type of native wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
It celebrates our birth, our natus, our sort of our origins as sacred. And it celebrates the natural world, all these NAT words that point back to the natural and the native as places of great wisdom. And I think one of the reasons why it's been difficult for many people in the Western world to re-access the indigenous or the native is that the sort of empires of religion and empires of thought and politics have so often described the native as sort of savage and having to, needed to be sort of conquered and sort of brought into so-called civilization. Where we are today, we're really learning that this notion of us needing to teach native peoples truth and missing the fact that we needed to learn their accessing of wisdom in the natural world. And I think one of the reasons why I think so many people on your side of the Atlantic in America and in Canada, there's a much sort of stronger and deeper reclaiming of the Celtic on your side of the Atlantic than there is on this side of the Atlantic. And I think one of the reasons for that is because many people in America and Canada have started to sense the wisdom of native spirituality and have in a sense asked, is there something similar in our Christian tradition that we could access. Because, of course, the great native teachers of North American spirituality and First Nations spirituality in Canada, they consistently say, well, don't look to us, look deep in your own inheritance, because all of our societies and nations essentially have their deep roots in a type of native or indigenous worldview. So how do we sort of dig back into that? And I think the Celtic is an expression of where many people are finding something resonant between what we've generally described as indigenous wisdom and Celtic wisdom.
The book itself, as you said, go through these 9 kind of luminary writers and poets and philosophers and theologians that have inspired you and been a source of wisdom. I had my favorites. I did notice that there's a lot of poets, and I know the Scots love their poets so passionately. I'm also curious, are you a poet? Do you write poetry?
I've tended to describe my writing of prayer as accessing the poet in me.
Yeah.
And for many years, I would sort of move back and forth between writing a book of prose, spirituality, and then writing a book of prayer, which was much more poetic. And it's a very different style of writing. And I think that what the poet does, the poet within us does, is to access the inner well of wisdom. Whereas I think often when we're writing prose, we're accessing sort of philosophical and spiritual and theological wisdom. For me, these have been twin ways of writing, and I enjoy both, but I know they're very different. And when I write poetically, the prayers that I write and the meditations at the end of each chapter in this new book, when I look at more poetic things that I've written, I think, did I write that? And I think the reason why I asked that is because I think it comes from within us. I happen to have written it, but I think the wellspring of the poetic is deep within the human soul. And when I'm writing prose, I mean, I look at prose that I've written and I see myself all over the page. I mean, because I'm accessing much more the intellectual and the rational and spiritual consciousness in that sense. But I think the poetic comes from a much deeper place within us. Some of the poets that I've really enjoyed accessing would also want to say that the earth itself is the great poem. So when we write poetically, we're really just accessing an expression of the divine that is already deep within earth.
And that's certainly true with some of the poems of, Not Shepherd. And
yeah,
I apologize. I don't normally mark books up. I marked this book up like crazy. It's a Jackson
that's the sort of
Pollock
book I
thing,
like.
Yeah. It's got sticky notes everywhere and markers everywhere, and it would take hours. I mean, I think I texted Seth. I go, "This is a 5-hour podcast episode," because I was like, "There's so much depth in here." So I wanted to. There's a few though that I would say that are somewhat paradoxical that I wanted to throw at you. Thomas Berry. I want to read one of the quotes from the book. "We are most ourselves," said Berry, "when we are most intimate with the rivers and the mountains and the woodlands, with the sun and the moon and the stars and the heavens." How do we do that when we have cities with 25 million people in them? In your mind, if there's a way back and the access is through what Thomas Berry is talking about, which I completely agree. I'm a guy. I lived in Alaska. I live in Hawaii. I have chosen. I left the big city a long time ago, and we purposely chose to stay away from living in a large city because, and the benefit is that we've had very fast access to amazing nature our whole lives. But how is it even possible with 8 billion people on the planet to do it? I don't. What's the way forward that way? I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's an enormous challenge, but I think that there are things that we can very intentionally do in our lives and in our lifestyles to, even in the city, we can find ways of being more attentive to the natural. I mean, one of the things I should say personally is that this place that I'm speaking from now, the eco-village of Findhorn up in the north of Scotland, this is going to become our home address. So quite soon we'll be leaving the city of Edinburgh, which has been home and which we've loved. And Edinburgh is, I suppose, an unusual city in that even in that city, there are so many green spaces to access. But I think for so many of us living in city environments, we can very importantly be attentive to some of the rhythm of sunrise and sunset. We can be largely attentive to the mystery of the moon's cycles, even in a city. I mean, so many in the city are denied access to the sense of the stars and the heavens. And someone like Barry would describe that as a deprivation of soul because we're not in touch with the heavens from the stars from which we've come.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, so many cities are attempting to reverence and make more access to green spaces, and that's to be enormously encouraged. It's part of our well-being, I believe. I think one of the other really important ways to stay in touch with Earth when we're living in the city is through the foods that we buy. Choosing to be sort of in awe of these vegetables and fruits and so on that come from Earth, I think we can find ways of much more consciously realizing, even in the city, these things are feeding my body and my soul. And these things come from the same divine source from which I have come, and to see that family likeness, in a sense, between humanity and everything that grows from the earth. So I think there are ways that we can do it, but that's not to suggest that it isn't deeply challenging. But our cities, interestingly, have been sort of centers of empire. Empire has tended to be city-based. Many of these native indigenous wisdoms and the Celtic tradition, which in fact empire found so difficult and wanted just to conquer us. And in part that was because these indigenous and native-based spiritualities resisted empire and city-based power.
Yeah. I wanted to comment on that because that's the thing is I think the way forward is something you hit on in the book quite a bit, as it's the emergence of the feminine. And then the cities are the representation of the masculine, and the feminine, as the feminine emerges, even within the home or within a space where as the feminine emerges, there seems to I know it's going to sound really stereotypical for a second, but like I've watched in our home where my wife, the more her sacred feminine has risen, the more she's returned the entire home to earth, even though we live in city. And it's just plants and stones, and you can see the office here. It's just giant rocks and stones everywhere. And she feeds us this really wholesome food. And every day, every day we're like, I want to eat a donut, and she's like, plants, 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 plants. Everybody and everything is returned to the most wholesome, clean eating. And it's because and I can tell it's a part. It's not I figured out what healthy food is. It's an emergence of the sacred feminine that has drawn her to that.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And Thomas Berry in chapter 1, I quote him as saying, earth consciousness and woman consciousness are inseparably related.
Yes.
And more deeply we return to consciousness and awareness of earth, the more deeply we will return to a true reverencing of the feminine.
That was a real kind of common theme through the whole book, in terms of dealing with masculine and feminine energies. There's right now we're obviously in the election season in the United States, and we are dealing with an overwhelmingly masculine kind of thing. But one of the things that if I talk to like kind of a normal people that are maybe don't think like us, they say, that's kind of a foo-foo talk, masculine energy, that you can't bring this type of dialogue into serious civics talk, like, you know what I mean? It's easy in Hawaii to talk about because we can go into Hawaiian native kind of, and that's another one of those kind of little paradoxical things where I say, how do we bring talks about feminine and masculine balance and talks of native wisdom into our civil discourse?
Mm-hmm.
These are the things that, like, the whole time I'm reading this book, I'm going, how do we get this into that? You know what I mean? It was really, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that for both of you guys.
Yeah, the shadow masculine, which has raised itself up over against earth and against the feminine. It gets a lot of coverage, a lot of sort of media attention and so on. And the shadow masculine is in many dimensions of life, political, religious, cultural, still has its sort of hands on quite a bit of power. power that holds some sort of horrendously destructive energy. And I believe that a deeper rebirthing is happening, and that is a rebirthing in relation to Earth and the sacred feminine. That may not be capturing the headlines in debates around what's happening in American politics and so on, but I think we can see it playing out politically. I think that at some level, the shadow masculine, the holders of shadow masculine power, at some level know that their days are numbered. It has no ultimate future, this false way of relating to Earth and the feminine. Because it's based on a lie. It's based on a denial of the deep truth of Earth and the feminine from which we are born. And I think because at some level, whether consciously or not, it knows its days are numbered, it's lashing out with a ferocity and a destructiveness that is sort of unmatched in terms of what the shadow masculine has done. But I don't believe it's the deep spirit of this age. I think something much deeper and profounder, Earth-related and feminine-related, is rising.
I was gonna say, like, it seems like that MacLeod had a lot to say about that. He had an ability to articulate these truths into a political sphere that was unique. I mean, would you say that?
For those of us, for our listeners who don't know who that is,
Oh, sorry. Well, I was wondering if you could say, well, you said a little bit about him in the book. You know, there was a little bit about MacLeod in the book. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about your mentors and the line that you come from, because you come from a line of men that had an ability to step into very high level masculine spaces and articulate these truths in really unique ways. And I think that's what you're doing in your writing. But they were, I mean, stepping up before, you know, British Parliament and high levels of government and saying these things. I'm curious about your, like, what George MacLeod would do now in a political arena, you know, to articulate these things.
Yeah, George MacLeod chapter, of course, is in Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, rather than the Great Search. But for those with eyes to see, I think there's this deep continuity between Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, drawing very explicitly on the Celtic, and the great prophets of the Great Search book are similarly sort of seeing our basis of healing and deep sense of home addressed spiritually as being within Earth and within the human soul. You know, like all great prophetic figures, George MacLeod had lots of inconsistencies as well. And I mean, this is true of, I suppose, nearly every great prophetic figure I've come across, because George was very in touch with Earth themes. He also knew some of the limitations of his culture, Edwardian culture. The relationship that Ali, my wife, and I had with George MacLeod was quite typical in some ways of MacLeod. I mean, he was very gentlemanly towards Ali and would be asking her, you know, how the family was and so on. It was with me that he engaged much more theologically and spiritually. So there was still a sort of, he knew how to bring young men close to him, but he didn't quite know how in his sort of Edwardian cultural background and shaping, how to relate very intimately to the feminine. But I think that his openness to Earth themes was part of this sort of prophetic preparing of the way for where we are today in relation to our Earth consciousness and a realizing that Earth consciousness and woman consciousness belong inseparably together. I think that, I suppose, one of the things that we do see in MacLeod, in that he believed that prayer and politics were to be very related, you know, that choosing to help shape the commonwealth of the nation, to help shape how communities live and relate. This was absolutely part of his spirituality. And I think that even politically, one of the things that was great about MacLeod, I mean, he was sort of left wing, off the map, yet he was married to Lorna, whom he loved, but she was sort of Tory, very conservative, almost off the map, so they were like sparring partners. And he once wrote a book called Only One Way Left, with all the sort of political implications of the word left. And he dedicated it to Lorna, his wife. He said, to Lorna, who was always right. But I think one of the great things about MacLeod that maybe indicates more feminine a sensibility in him than he might have even been conscious of. He knew the sacredness and the importance of interrelationship. And I think this is something that the feminine within us is very strong at, working always to stay in relationship. And so even his sort of political opponents in the House of Lords and elsewhere in the British context, he was a real master of not letting political disagreement get in the way of a deep sense of bond between the human spirit. Some of the money that came in the early days for the rebuilding of the Abbey on Iona came from sort of British people who were in bed with the military. And here he is sort of building a community of non-violence. And where is he getting a lot of his money? He's getting sort of money from shipbuilding magnates in the Clyde who are sort of supplying the British government with warships. And so I think he's a pretty interesting person that way. And he just refused to allow political disagreements to sever personal relationship.
I've read most of your books, JP. I've read most of them, and I've heard you teach for a long, long time. And I bugged you one time. I don't know if you remember this, but I bugged you one time because I always think about what would I love to hear him write about? Because, you know, I read your stuff and I go, see, he's a scholar, but he's a teacher, but he's a mystic, maybe? I don't know if he's a mystic. Like, it's this thing, but it's very clear. I'm like, is he a historian? Like, I have a hard time categorizing you, but you're clearly very scholarly in your writing and stuff like that. And I've always wondered, like, what would I love to hear him write about? And there's two things specifically, and one I'll bring up because this is really where my question is. But the first one I'll mention just in passing. But I asked you one time, I said, man, I would love to hear you do a true exposition on J.R. Tolkien. And you were like, oh, I remember you reacted. You were like, that would be wonderful. I'm like, yes, it would. You're like, I don't think I have time to do the scholarship. I was like, I'm curious because you mentioned the masculine shadow, but I rarely hear you go into any depth of your perspective or understanding of evil itself. And I'm curious, one, why that is, and two, what you believe it to be, I guess. What do you see? I mean, we're seeing great evil done in the world right now. And I'm curious what if we sat down with all the people that you spoke about in this book and we were to discuss evil. I'm curious about your thoughts on that, what it is and how it manifests in this world and what's the way forward there as well.
Yeah. Thank you. In The Great Search, there's a chapter on Julian of Norwich, and one of the lovely things that Julian of Norwich, this 13th century mystic, she has these series of revelations. They're almost sort of dreamlike awarenesses of the divine. And one of the things she says is she addresses sin at one point, and she says to sin, she says, I saw nothing of you because you are nothing. By that, she meant that sinning or evil does not have its origins in the divine. So the extent to which we are sinning, the extent to which we participate in evil in our world, we are participating in something that has no future because it has no sort of ultimate or eternal root. And then she also goes on to say, but sin is creating havoc and it's bringing suffering. Therefore, we really do need to look at it and name it. We need to confront it and confess it within ourselves. But she says it's really important that we not focus too much on sin or give it too much attention, in that it is ultimately nothing. It's leading us and our world into nothingness to the extent that we're following it and are captivated by it. And she says, when we address the sinning or the evil of others, it's important that we do so only if we can do so in a posture of mercy, and only to the extent that we are praying and hoping that sinning and that evil might be transformed by grace so that people will come back into their true nature. And Julian also says, sort of quite amusingly, we often get far too much satisfaction by looking at the colorfulness of people's sinning. and best not to address it unless we can address it with the hope of mercy for the sinner. But the other person that I found really, really helpful in relation to evil is the 9th century Irish teacher John Scotus Eriugena. And whenever Eriugena refers to Satan, the Satan figure in Scripture, he refers to him by his original name, and that is Lucifer, which means angel of light. And one of the things that Eriugena says about Satan, whom he calls Lucifer, angel of light, is that Satan is false to the extent that he's not being himself. And I don't think he's just speaking about a Satan figure out there. I think he's speaking about the capacity for evil or the capacity for sinning that is deep within us all. How do we, at this moment in time in the world, when we think of perpetrators of terrible sort of falseness and perpetrators of evil and destructiveness, how shall we address them? How shall we see them? Shall we see them essentially as sons of light, brothers, sisters of light, or do we name them as sort of monstrous and evil figures? And of course, the only way to deal with the monster is sort of kill the monster. So I think that Eriugena, by even calling Satan angel of light, is saying, let's keep looking for the essence and true heart of the perpetrator of falseness and wrong. And let's see that the way forward is not to call the perpetrator of wrong to become like us, which is a new form of self-righteousness, of course, but to call the perpetrator of wrong and evil to become truly themselves, that is, to return to their true essence. That's part of how I hope to live in relation to the terrible sinning, the terrible sundering, the terrible wrongdoing and evil that we witness in the world, to see it as not the essence of any human being, but rather the extent to which they've fallen out of touch with their true essence made of God.
That's a nice segue to talk about Carl Jung.
Yeah,
my favorite quote in the book, I think you wrote this line though, we are living in the midst of a great turd falling. The turd. I like highlighted that over and over again. I was like, oh my gosh, that's so good. I actually want to, well, if you don't mind, I'm going to read the kind of paragraph before that, so there's some context for everyone. The death and disappearance of God, as Jung put it, has led to the modern decline of religion. When he was a boy, only 12 years of age, Jung had a prophetic intuition of the coming collapse of Western Christianity. Walking home from school one day as he passed through the cathedral square of Basel, he became aware of an image that so shocked him that he hid it away in his unconscious for decades until finally in his 60s he was able to look at it again and speak about it. What he saw within himself that day as a schoolboy in a cathedral square of Basel was God sitting on a golden throne high above the world, and from under the throne an enormous turd fell, crashing through the sparkling new roof of the cathedral, shattering it to pieces and breaking the walls asunder. That one hit me. I was really like, when I read that, I was like, that image was just like so graphic, and
I'm curious if that was an optional second title for it was instead of The Great Search.
yes, that was going to be the subtitle, The Great Search. Yeah, the falling of the turd. Yeah.
I was telling that story of Carl Jung in Ireland a number of years ago, and at the end of my talk, Sister of Mercy, I think it was, came up to me and said, "Now, John Philip, tell me exactly, what is a turd?" And I mean, in part, sort of verbally, the word turd might be misunderstood in Ireland because, of course, they speak about first, second, third, fourth, and so on. But yeah, she did in the end understand, and I mean, it's a powerful image. It's also understandable in some ways why this boy was not able to speak about the image, and even until he was about 60 years of age, he wasn't able to articulate it. But I think it was a very prophetic moment, because that destruction or that collapse of Christianity as we have known it, the walls are crumbling in a place like Scotland, and many other parts of the Western world, the collapse of religion as we have known it is seismic. In another number of years, religion will simply not be as we've known it. And the other thing that Jung goes on to say is that God is not the sort of respecter of religion. No matter how sacred we might call it.
Right.
Jung, I think, is one of the people in the new book who understands the origins of the word religion as coming from the Latin religare, which means to bind together again. And so if the sort of essential inspiration of religion is about binding together heaven and earth, the divine and the human, the spirit and matter, then religion's not been doing a very good job of that. And we're in such a precarious situation as a human species on earth that clearly religion as we have known it has not been capable of significantly addressing the challenge that confronts us now, and is certainly not been holding together the human mystery and the earth mystery, or the divine mystery and the human mystery deeply. Yeah. And I love what Thomas Berry says in the first chapter of how religion has been, so much of our religion has been based on relationship between the human and the divine, and the corollary of the human and human relationship, so loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. But the missing piece has been to love every species as we love ourselves, or to love every species as we love, to see every species as our neighbor. And that's the big challenge of this moment in time.
When I speak to writers like yourself, or I have a conversation with Rob Bell or guys like that, I often wonder about your own personal life, because especially partly because I'm behind you on that path, like looking forward and asking what's ahead, because you've been articulating these truths, like what you wrote about in this book, you've been speaking about for years, right? You've been writing these kinds of things. And the book did feel, by the way, it felt like a sequel to Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul. It felt like a part 2 kind of thing. I'm curious where you see your teaching going. Where you see your life going, what is giving you passion right now? What is something that's lighting you up? Like, you're mid-70s now?
I'm not quite that wise yet, but I'm 71. Yes.
71. Okay, I was trying to remember. I was trying to remember that, but I'm curious, where do you see your 70s and 80s looking like as far as your work and your passion and your, I remember when I asked you about Tolkien, you're like, oh, I don't know if I can find the space to do the scholarship.
You can do it, man. You can do it. We believe in you, man.
I'm curious. By the way, David is my brother. Knows more about Tolkien than I think any living human being, and
man. But he's obviously. I mean, David, you're obviously the one to write that book, then, not me.
I don't have. As an American in Hawaii, I feel somewhat bereft of the authority, to
yeah. No, it gives you some objective perspective.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Seth. And a number of years ago, and I talk about this a bit in the introduction to The Great Search, I relinquished my ordination as a minister of the Church of Scotland. And that was, primarily a decision I made for my own integrity. For many years, I was aware that what I was teaching in terms of sacredness of earth and sacredness of every human being and life form, this was at odds with a lot of what I had signed up for, as it were, and at odds with some of the fundamental creedal statements and doctrines of Western Christianity. So there was a deep sort of disconnect that I was feeling between my teachings and what I'm trying to live and the formal teachings of the church. So it was really important to let go. I was offered a phrase by a pilgrim to Iona last year that I found very helpful. I mean, one of the words that I've not used is, rather than relinquishing, sometimes people say, "Oh, you've renounced your ordination," and renounce is not a word that I use. For me, it's too critical a word. It's too much a sort of denouncing. And so relinquishing was important for me. But this woman in conversation with me said, "Oh, you've given back your ordination." And I thought that was a really helpful way to describe what I've done. In a sense, giving it back, saying it no longer fits. It's not, it's not right for me now.
Yeah.
So that was a decision I took for my own integrity as a teacher. And I've certainly not wanted it to be a judgment of many of my brothers and sisters who continue in ordained ministry within the church, because I have a lot of respect for what so many of them are trying to do. So I didn't take that decision as a way of judging those who are continuing to work within the four walls of the church, as it were. But one of the things that I have found helpful in my own personal journey, having given back my ordination, is that deep within our Judeo-Christian inheritance, right within our scriptural inheritance as well, there has been a very clear place given to the prophetic as well as the priestly, to the wilderness as well as to the temple. The reality is that I believe that we need one another, or that the voice speaking from the wilderness, and I see myself very much in the wilderness now in relation to religion, but any prophetic voice coming out of the wilderness, I think needs to speak essentially from a place of love for those who are continuing to gather within the temple. It's really the family, it's my family of origin that is in the temple. So the only value to trying to give utterance and expression from the wilderness is to speak with love, and is to speak with hope for what the family might choose to do, to be able to reform what happens in the temple and within the four walls of religion, to come back into relationship, with what the Celts call the cathedral of earth, sea, and sky, and to see that what happens within the four walls of religion or within the temple should at best be seen as like a side chapel onto the living cathedral of earth, sea, and sky. So at this point in my life, I'm experiencing tremendous relief, tremendous liberation and freedom to try to speak from within the soul, and not to speak in any way that's bound by the formulas and creedal statements of religion over the centuries, and very free to try to be true to the wisdom of Jesus, rather than primarily sign up to the church's statements about Jesus. And I think this is one of the really interesting aspects of so many of us who are in religious exile at this moment in time, is that I think for the most part, those of us in exile from Christian religion are great lovers of Jesus and great believers in his wisdom. And in some ways, cutting the tie or giving back my ordination has provided me with even greater freedom. And I so love what I'm doing. I so love, pilgrimage weeks on Iona, and I so love the opportunity to try to express the soul, the human soul, for this moment in time in writing and in teaching, that I think I'll be doing it for a long time, as long as the body is able. I mean, I am sort of reshaping aspects of my schedule. So I'm cutting down a little bit on travel across the Atlantic. I don't see my life and lifestyle changing very much over the next decade, as long as I'm given the health to carry on.
Where do you see your writing going? Like when you think about the next book and this kind of thing, what do you see?
Well, it's one of the things I've loved about writing over the last 100 years or so, is that when I'm finishing one book, nearly always when I'm literally writing the conclusion of a book, I get a sense of what the next book should be. So much so that I now sort of quite consciously look forward to the writing of the conclusion, because I'm going to get a sort of
download
intimation of what the next book should be.
Yeah.
And this time I not only got a clear sense of where I'd like to move next, but I actually received a title for the next book. And often title is the really hard thing to work through often, and you have to wrestle away with your literary agent and your publisher to get the right. But when I shared the title for the next book with my literary agent, he said, "Oh yeah, that's great, perfect."
Nice.
But I won't, in fact, offer publicly what that title is at this stage.
We were about to get some news. That was about to be news. I was about to get
But-
it. I was just sitting there waiting for it.
Yeah, but it's really about the relationship between spirituality and the outward work of transformation and change. So it's about sort of inner grounding for outward change.
Interesting.
I've been a bit slow to realize over the decades what my gift is in writing. And I've really, if I may speak of myself in terms of having a gift, but what I realize I really love is channeling the wisdom of those who have gone before us, in a sense, transmitting their wisdom from the past into this moment in time. My awareness came in part through an Iona pilgrimage a number of years ago. There was a Buddhist on the pilgrimage, and he was there with his wife, who was Christian. And we were going around the circle, people offering their reflections on what had happened during the pilgrimage week on Iona. And when we got to this Buddhist gentleman, the word that he offered was transmission. And that's an important word in Buddhist spirituality, because they see that the role of the teacher is not to ever assume that he or she is an original fount of wisdom. The role of the teacher is to see that they transmit wisdom from those who have gone before us and speak it into new language for this moment in time. One of the great things about being a transmitter is that when I'm working on a book, or when I'm researching, the themes of the next book, I'm being fed by some of the greatest thinkers and spiritual writers that humanity has known. And that encourages me to believe that, well, if I am being fed, then there's some hope that my writings are going to feed others as well.
Oh, so that's amazing. Do you have a copy of the book with you, JP?
Are you kidding? I never go.
It's the essential read of all humanity right now on Amazon. Normally when we do this podcast, I ask people to do a blessing at the end. And by the way, the last time we had you on the show, you did this blessing at the end, and I got more emails about that blessing. It was unbelievable. And they were like, I have to read everything he's ever written, because they were like in tears after. It was what it struck me was that there's a lot of people who need blessings. They need people. They need people to give them permission to feel some of that, But today I wanted to ask you if you would read from one of the meditative practices, particularly from Thomas Berry on page 31.
Yeah, absolutely. On the blessing front, I'm a great believer in offering blessing, and I think that this wellspring of blessing is deep within us all. Yeah. This is something we can do for one another, with words, but not always just with words, even in how we look at one another, even in how we listen to one another. We can be bearers of blessing. This I believe, is an important part of what it is to be made of God, that we carry energies in us, pure gift of God. We carry energies that can bless each other. So I'm a great believer in that. So I'm glad I offered a blessing. I can't remember what it was.
It was lovely.
So this is the meditative practice, Seeking Vision, from the end of chapter 1, in which I access the wisdom of Thomas Berry for today. As the darkness of early morning longs for light, so my soul longs to see again the great spiritual fire of life's beginnings, still shining in galaxies beyond numbering, and here in me and every life form, countless streams of glory in a single flow of light, each one irreplaceable. As the darkness of early morning longs for light, so my soul longs to see again. Amen.
thank you for writing this book. Like I said early on, it was the right book for me personally at the right time. I cried a lot during the reading because I really needed this. I needed, as a person who is post-religion, I needed to see some light, some way forward, and it's a real blessing. So, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Thank you,
coming on.
David.
Yeah.
You know, as Carl Jung says, when we weep, something in the salt sea of life's origins is stirring in us again.
Yeah, I feel that.
Yeah,
for
that's
sure.
a very beautiful expression of reading the book. Thank you, David. So good to be with you.
Yeah.
Blessings to you.
Blessings. Thank you so much, JP.
Yeah.
Mm.
The Voyagers podcast is produced by Sugarsled Productions in Kula on the island of Maui. It's hosted, written, created, edited, distributed by me, David Glenn Taylor. Yep, I do the whole thing. As I mentioned last time, you can learn more about John Philip Newell's work at his website, earthandsoul.org, or you can follow him on Facebook and Instagram. I've already lent my copy of The Great Search to a friend. It was all marked up, but she didn't mind. So buy the book, read it, make your notes, and then pass it on. Like I said, it's the right book at the right time. And just a bit about the Voyagers show. I haven't produced an episode of the Voyagers in a while, not because there weren't many interesting people to talk to, but because the supply of time that the pandemic provided ran short once the world opened up. But amazingly, many of my listeners have stuck around, and for that, I am grateful. So, I'm going to make a simple goal in putting out an episode every 2 months. That's 6 a year. I think that's something I can handle. God knows I met some fascinating characters in the last 2 years, and I'd love for you to meet them too. So, for now, and until the next episode, mahalo for listening, friends.